Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to this episode of Tristan and the Classics, where we're taking a look at where to start with serious classics. And we're going to be taking a look at 10 different classic books that you might find interesting. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? It's very important before looking at these 10 books that we understand what we mean when we say serious classics, or what I might call classics with a big C. Now, I've got another video called Where to Start with Classic Literature or Classic Books, and I cover books from a number of genres in that. However, the serious classics, they're more concerned with the human condition. They're more introspective. They are to be dwelt on, to think about. They're where an author has observed something particular about life which they think might be a fundamental truth for everybody. Or it may be something about our inner condition or how we experience life. And they explore it through a book. And it doesn't work like genre fiction, which has sort of an XYZ layout that you can just fill in the blanks kind of thing. These stories require participants from the reader, for you to slowly mull over some of the things being said, to perceive the depth between the lines or inside the paragraphs that are speaking directly to your experiences and asking you to compare with what's going on in the book. And I know a lot of people are looking for getting into the classics on YouTube, and a lot of them want, when they say that, they mean they want to get into more serious literature. And it doesn't have to be just classics that are serious literature, it's just these are ones that have stood the test of time. And so with that in mind, I'm going to take you through a quick synopsis of each book and why it's a good place to start if you're trying to get into serious classic literature. The first classic book on our list is by Thomas Hardy, and I chose The Mayor of Casterbridge. Many of his works could fill this criteria. The Mayor of Casterbridge is very approachable, and Thomas Hardy is an author that is very concerned with suffering, with travail, with the difficulties we experience in life and what's behind them. Now this book follows the protagonist Michael Henchard with a very unusual start to the book. It's not a spoiler because it's literally the start of the book. He sells his wife and child in a moment of drunken desperation, and then rises his way to the top of some other town to become the mayor. And when he's established in that position, lo and behold, his wife and daughter return years later. What's going to happen? How has he changed as a person? Now, this can talk about revenge, it can talk about jealousy and the like, but the real thing you'll want to be thinking about when reading this book is, to what extent is our character also our fate in life? Can we change our stars truly? Can we become different people to what we once were? The key when reading serious literature like this is not to assume you already know the answer. Whatever your initial instinct is, you might agree with Hardy, you might not, but listen to it from his perspective and try to see how the author is tussling with an idea that was quite prominent in his day. You know, it's nature-nurture, isn't it? And that's why this book is so good. It's also an excellent read with many things that go on in the book, especially some of the other characters that have an influence on Henchard himself. I'll just give you the reading of the first paragraph so that you get an idea of the tone of writing that Hardy uses. One evening of late summer, before the 19th century had reached 1/3 of its span, a young man and woman, the latter carrying a child, were approaching the large village of Weydon Priors in Upper Wessex on foot. They were plainly, but not ill, clad, though the thick hoar of dust which had accumulated on their shoes and garments from an obviously long journey lent a disadvantageous shabbiness to their appearance just now. The second book on our list is an unusual one, and it is Alone in Berlin by Hans Fallada. Now, there's a particular reason I picked this book, and you'll see why when I read an excerpt of it. But the story follows an older couple called Anna and Otto Quangle in, I think the year is 1940, and they live in, obviously, Nazi Germany, Berlin. Now, very quickly, we learn of their plight, and something turns them against their ideal of the Führer. But what's life like in a city that you're under constant suspicion in? The Gestapo are around, and obviously no one wants to cross them because, you can be disappeared. They live in an apartment block with various different characters, some of whom, like the Persics, are ardent fascists. They're real Nazis. But Otto and Anna want to set up their own kind of resistance to Hitler, not a military one, not a campaigning one, but through the smallest, almost insignificant means of opposing in their own way. And that is to leave little messages around Berlin with negative comments about the Third Reich and about the Führer, trying to undermine people's confidence in what's going on. Now, their efforts seem so feeble, but it is a tale of courage. And it's very tense the way it's drawn. It's very blue-grey. And I don't just say that because of the cover on this. They've actually nailed the cover for this book. It is a blue-grey, overcast atmosphere. And fear and worry lurk everywhere. But you get a whole array of different characters, as you would in real life, rather than an overblown cinematic Nazi Germany, here's the resistance kind of thing. It's just ordinary people with their various flaws and foibles, and you just track Anna and Otto through the story, but many others, like Detective Escherich of the Gestapo, who is tasked with hunting down the people who are leaving these little postcards everywhere with negative comments. You see him, and they're all very, very human. It will make you think, what would I have done then? Because most of us identify with heroes and think we would never be the bad guys. But most of us are not heroic, and most wouldn't have the courage to really do something dramatic. But would we even have the courage to do something little, or would we just go along with everything? An absolutely phenomenal book, and one that you may not be used to reading if you're normally into genre fiction, for instance. Because it's got a very distinct style. Now, I'll read you the first paragraph and you'll see why. Some bad news. The postwoman, Eva Kluger, slowly climbs the steps of 55 Jablonski-Strasse. She's tired from her round, but she also has one of those letters in her bag that she hates to deliver, and is about to have to deliver to the Quangles on the second floor. Did you notice something unusual about the style of that? It's something you don't always see. It's written in third person present tense. Third person often is used in past tense, as in recounting a tale. By doing third person present, you get an eye on the wall sensation. It throws you off kilter. You feel slightly exposed, as if you're involved with them as the Gestapo and various informants move around the scene. It is, a bit grueling at times, this book, but very, very worth it. So that was number 2, Alone in Berlin by Hans Fallada. The third classic on our list of classic books to start reading if you want to begin getting into serious classics is a famous one, and it is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, you may be inclined to not want to read this because you've seen the film and therefore we think we know something of it. Well, one of the things I've been talking about in my Patreon group of late, and we've been looking at over the past few months, is the importance of the American novel on literature. And I find the American novel is very introspective, very explorative of humankind, of the way we feel and think psychologically inside. But it's very accessible as well because it's so modern in its tone. And F. Scott Fitzgerald is a fantastic writer. His writing is so delightful. It's almost sumptuous at times. Now, the story, as you probably know, is of J. Gatsby. It's told from the perspective of our protagonist, relating what he learns about Jay Gatsby. And Jay Gatsby has idealised Daisy Buchanan, a girl he absolutely loves. And he sets up his great mansion at West Egg in New York, and he throws these lavish parties, and you get all these kind of socialites come along. And yet Jay Gatsby always seems to stand at the edge. He never gets drawn in, and there's a curiosity, a mystery about him. Now, a lot of people say that this book is to do with, the American dream or the mighty dollar or the roaring 20s kind of thing. It's the roaring 40s is the phrase, isn't it? But the 20s. And yet, there's something much, much deeper. It's not just about money and wealth. When you read this, contemplate as you go along the power of ideal, or the clinging to maybe an ideal that never was there, and the chasing after a dream, and what it can lead you to, and whether it's more destructive having a dream, whether some dreams should be left alone or memories should be laid to rest, and that they're better where they were in your mind than they ever would be if you visited. That's very much a Edith Wharton kind of quote. But that's what's involved in this book. And there's some great twists and turns and ins and outs in here. And you do sense a certain moral thinness that's going on, which subverts a lot of the characters. And, there's 5 main characters in the book. It's quite short as well, about 120 pages long, but really well written. And the last 2 pages are to die for. They are amazing. It's the last 3 paragraphs are even better, which pretty much sums up the green light. If you've read it before, you'll know what I mean. What it sums up for all of us. So yes, that's The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'll just read you the opening, because it gives you the tone, and I'll mention something about it in a moment. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticising anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way, and I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. Now I'm going to stop there. Did you notice something about this? We're introduced to a first-person narrative, but the story is about someone else. So it's a first-person observer position of writing, rather than them talking about their own life. And it's not quite fly on the wall. You're in there, and somewhat you're able to pass certain judgments. You're able to see weaknesses more realistically because it's someone relating what they've actually seen. So that's something good about the style of the writing in this, and the choice of perspective in writing, the choice of narrator. The 4th book on our list is The Painted Veil by Somerset Maugham. I can't really think of a better book to take you into the more thought-provoking pieces of literature, and yet it's so straightforward and beautiful and enjoyable as a story. The Painted Veil, we follow the sparkling, pretty and charming Kitty Vane, a very socialite girl, over in Hong Kong, and her more stolid and stagnant bacteriologist husband, Walter. And they end up going into China during a typhoid epidemic because Walter wants to help people over there. Now, why would a socialite go, you ask? Well, that's part of it, because of course Walter has discovered, and this again is no spoiler because it's right at the very first page, that Kitty has been having an affair. Now, as we go through the book, which is told from Kitty's perspective, we sort of begin to understand the more vacuous insipid, jejune world of the socialites. That although on the outside, like on this, she has a lovely red dress, although colourful on the outside and full of decorative adornments, the personality within is empty and hollow. Whereas someone who may be dull and boring on the outside may run deep, quite still waters run deep and all that. Now, the book is so reflective, like it makes you go inwards, the way the characters meet, because this book is still. It doesn't move very fast, but it matches the currents of our emotions when we realise how maybe shallow we actually are, how vapid we may be, right down at core. And how Kitty begins to observe other people whom she would never otherwise even see or notice in her life, had it not been for this situation. The idea of the book was actually taken by Morm from a story he heard when in Italy about how to kill a person accidentally, but on purpose. But you'll have to read the book to find out how that's sort of pulled off. But it's the way he takes us into the human emotion, and instead of turning that idea of how to kill someone accidentally on purpose into a whodunit or a mystery or a suspense or a thriller, what he does, The Painted Veil, comes from a poem, and this is often something you find with literary fiction. There's an observation by a poet or a religious text or a philosophical text or whatever, that the author thinks, I want to explore that idea, and puts it into people and makes them live, and honestly deals with them to see what would happen with this observation that's come from a poem or text or whatever. And that's what you get with The Painted Veil. This is actually a charming book. We did this in my Patreon group. It was one of the favourite ones over the course of the last year. And it highly recommended. But it will give you a great taste if you want to get into classic literature about what you can discover. But again, take it slowly. I'm just going to read you a bit from the first page, not quite the opening paragraph, to give you an idea of how well Somerset Maugham can write. They spoke in whispers now. She was quaking. It occurred to him that in an emergency she would lose her head, and on a sudden he felt angry with her. If it wasn't safe, why the devil had she said it was? She caught her breath and put her hand on his arm. He followed the direction of her glance. They stood facing the windows that led out onto the veranda. They were shuttered, and the shutters were bolted. They saw the white china knob of the handle slowly turn. They had heard no one walk along the veranda. It was terrifying to see that silent motion. A minute passed, and there was no sound. Then, with the ghastliness of the supernatural, in the same stealthy, noiseless, and horrifying manner, they saw the white china knob of the handle at the other window turn also. It was so frightening that Kitty, her nerves failing her, opened her mouth to scream. But seeing what she was going to do, he swiftly put his hand over it, and her cry was smothered in his fingers. That's good writing, isn't it? Maugham was very popular in his day, and I highly recommend that you read The Painted Veil if you want more introspective, thoughtful, classic literature to experiment with. The fifth book on our list is a very well-known book, very popular. You may even have done it in school, but don't let that put you off going back and reading it again. It is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck is such a terrific writer. One of my favourite writers of all time. Now, Of Mice and Men is a novella. It's about 100, maybe just under 100 pages long, and yet stacked full of pathos, emotion, and thought-provoking ideas. Because in this book, you have the displaced ranch workers, George and Lenny. George, quite clever and smart. Lenny is a big, strong fellow who's a bit simple. And they're itinerant workers. We're sat in the Great Depression in America, sort of 29, 30. And they're just trying to get by. Now, they have dreams, like the American dream, of owning their own land and being sort of free from being interfered with, especially the government. And they have hope. And that's part of the pain in this. Because there's, it's a discussion of how hard-hearted some people can become to their fellow humans. The toughness of life, the social injustices, but I don't mean that in the modern canting way that it's often talked about, genuinely difficult times, and the characters they come across as they move from farm to farm. But primarily, because it's very moving, this book, and very simple, a very simple tale, because novellas, rather than having subplots, they just follow one particular idea. But what Steinbeck is so good at is getting inside a human being. He sort of puts people on as overcoats. He wears them, becomes them, sees the world from their perspective, and then shares their perspective with us. One of the things we normally identify with protagonists, and I'm going to do a video at some later point, maybe even next week, on questions to ask when reading classic literature to get more out of it. But we normally always see ourselves from the protagonist's eyes. But one of the key things in a book like Of Mice and Men is to understand that for the time being, we are the external characters to the two main characters in this. And if you read it that way, it shows maybe how calloused we have become in our modern and quick world, in a world that has money accessible technically to everybody, and that idea, that dream, can sort of make us a bit hard-hearted towards others, that we're too judgmental, too quick to assume things, and then too quick to judge. Something that George recognises, something that Lenny doesn't. It's a really, really good book. And it's funny, many of my fellow friend readers have never read this. It just never appeals to them. I don't know why. Maybe because it's read at school. I don't know. And they think it's going to be simple, or I don't know. But it is such a beautiful book. It's a book I never did it at school, but I doubt I would have appreciated it anywhere near as much as I do now that I'm a bit older. Anyway, I'll just read you the beginning of the book. A few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm too, for it has slipped twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. On one side of the river, the golden foothill slopes curve up to the strong and rocky Gabilan Mountains, but on the valley side, the water is lined with trees. Willows, fresh and green with every spring, carrying in their lower leaf junctures the debris of the winter's flooding. And sycamores, with mottled white recumbent limbs and branches that arch over the pool. On the sandy bank under the trees, the leaves lie deep and so crisp that a lizard makes a great skittering if he runs among them. Rabbits come out of the brush to sit on the sand in the evening, and the damp flats are covered with the night tracks of raccoons, and with the spread pads of dogs from the ranches, and with the split wedge tracks of deer that come to drink in the dark. That's the opening paragraph. What's lovely about that, a lot of our writing now is all in media res with the opening. So in other words, in the thick of action, we want to get in there, get going, and it's become somewhat trite maybe to start off by describing the scenery. But it's a very important way to start this book because it's all about the tone. Steinbeck is a master at getting you to settle into a rhythm which persuades you almost subconsciously how to begin reading the book. And he does it so well. He writes description exquisitely. I mean, I've got Thomas Hardy in here. I would say he does it slightly better. But storytelling, I would say Steinbeck is the better of the two. So that was the next one, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. Our sixth classic on this list is a book that had quite the cult following, but you don't hear quite so much of it anymore. And it is Perfume by Patrick Suskind. This book is quite mesmerising. It's captivating in a morbid kind of way. and is a really good read, although I must warn you that there are certain passages which can be a little bit grim right towards the end, the way this book ends. You know, it's not for the faint-hearted kind of thing. I don't mean blood and guts. I'm more talking about sexuality. But overall, it doesn't talk about much of that. Now, the book itself is set in the 18th century, so the 1700s. And our protagonist, or anti-hero, is Jean-Baptiste Grenouille. And he is born of a poverty-stricken mother, a fishwife, and he has this extraordinary sense of smell. And the story is about an obsession about making or capturing the perfect scent. But this comes at the cost of young women. And it's, you know, it's a very dark psychological book of getting into the mind of an anti-hero himself. There's darkly humorous as well in passages. But we follow Grenouille as he begins to learn the methods of capturing perfume, how to capture a scent in a bottle, and then how he wants to go on his way. And he needs this one particular ingredient, which unfortunately costs the lives of others. And it's a very unusual book because he's quite reclusive. You don't get much conversation going on. But what great literature often does, and what makes great literature great in many instances, is the powerful observation of the author. The ability to see things in day-to-day, in detail, that we often miss. In fact, that the majority would miss. The description of a perfumery in the 1700s in this book is absolutely wonderful. I mean, I was enthralled by it. And yet nothing much was going on. It was just so brilliantly written. But like I say, it's a little bit disturbing at times because it's a tale of obsession. Imagine someone that is completely fixated on something and is amoral because, you know, imagine not having a conscience, what that would allow you to do. I genuinely enjoyed this book. Like I say, I found the ending a bit odd and little tiny passages a bit, you know, not always my cup of tea, but nonetheless a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing. And it is a book I'd recommend. So there you go, Patrick Susskind by Perfume by Patrick Susskind. I'll just read you the first paragraph of this because it is just delicious the way he writes. In 18th century France, there lived a man who was one of the most gifted and abominable personages in an era that knew no lack of gifted and abominable personages. His story will be told here. His name was Jean-Baptiste Grenouille. And if his name, in contrast to the names of other gifted abominations, de Sades, for instance, or Saint-Just, Fouché, Bonaparte, etc., has been forgotten today, it is certainly not because Grenouille fell short of those more famous blackguards when it came to arrogance, misanthropy, immorality, or more succinctly, wickedness, but because his gifts and his sole ambition were restricted to a domain that leaves no traces in history, to the fleeting realm of scent. Now, isn't that the most charming opening to a book? The next book on our list is a book by the great author Charles Dickens, and it is A Tale of Two Cities. I picked this with deliberate intent for a video like this because when a lot of people think of getting into the classics, Charles Dickens is one of the authors they often tend to think about. But Charles Dickens has a particular style of writing, which I personally love. Others come into it and can be not so impressed with it because he's just unique in the way he puts things together. A Tale of Two Cities, on the other hand, I would call this the most un-Dickensian of Dickens' works. because he doesn't caricature quite so much his characters. He doesn't depend upon the humours, if you know what that means in literature. Now, he based this story, I believe this is his only historical novel, but he based it on Carlyle's The French Revolution, which he used to carry around with him. Dickens was a fan of Carlyle's work. And so he bases the background of it all from there. The story follows Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton, two men from very different backgrounds whose lives become intertwined with each other in an era of the terror in France, in an era where danger lurked if you lived in France. And what Dickens does through this, he's a master at drawing characters, at drawing people. Knitting has never looked so malevolent when you read this book. You'll know what I mean when you've read it. Madame Defarge, for those of you who have. What he does in this book, he weaves a story of heroism, a story of sacrifice, and a story of redemption. He's very good, Dickens, and very interested in the nobler qualities of a human being. And to that end, he can be sentimental. I did a video recently of how to read Charles Dickens, and in there I explain why sentimentality isn't a bad thing necessarily. I really recommend you watch that video. It's very good if you want to get into Dickens or if you like Dickens. So I'm not going to give much more away about this story, but there are some great scenes when the people of Paris rise up in revolt against the aristocrats, and the turmoil and anger and the repression that the peasants have been through. But Dickens demonstrates that all good ideas and all noble ambitions can be thrown completely the other end of the pendulum to cause no end of wickedness themselves. But it's that role between these men of different backgrounds, Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton, and the changing of a person completely, which leads to one of the most famous end lines in all of literature in this book, and it is very, very powerful. It's a book to really contemplate. You might think when you read it, well, this is about the French Revolution, so I don't see how it has any relevance today. Look for the humanity. Take away the basic ornamentation of a particular age. Humans don't change. And so look for the human attitude. I'm going to do a video about this, but like 2 questions particularly you should ask when reading pretty much any book. If you pause to think it over, this book can strike quite deeply within you. And so that's all I'm going to say about this. Now I'm going to read the opening paragraph. It's very unusual, and I'll make a small comment about it once I finish reading it. But of course, I think some have called this the most famous opening line to a novel. So, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. There is quite a lot that could just be said about this one opening paragraph, how it's misread, misunderstood, and its brilliance. It is a classic example of rhetoric being used, the contrasting of things constantly, and the rhythm of up and down. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. This is all rhetorical. Dickens is a master at rhetoric. He was a skilled and trained journalist, and he used to report on the law courts in his day. But he's just saying that there is 2 worlds going on, one in which everything is brilliant and light and hope and whatnot, and the other world is all dark and despair and the worst of times. And of course he's comparing London in the late 1700s, which is prospering, to France in the late 1700s, which is just about to undergo the terror, where people are getting their heads chopped off left, right and centre. So that was the opening of the Charles Dickens book, A Tale of Two Cities. And it is an excellent book if you want to get into more serious literature from the past. So there you go. The next book on our list of classics to get into, which explores or makes you go inward, is an autobiography. Of course, they're very powerful for sharing deep reflections, because if someone's written a book themselves, not just hiring ghostwriters to make money, then they've given a lot of thought to what they've been through, and they're distilling their observations and experiences for you and me to ponder on. And the one I've picked is the excellent Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves. Now, Robert Graves, a poet. He comes from a very, quite a privileged background, but he entered into the trenches in the First World War, along with, well, many a great generation, really. I've talked elsewhere about this. It can be called the Poets' War. So many great minds went into the trenches and, of course, were lost. So it makes you wonder what course civilization would have took had so many thousands of brilliant thinkers not actually met their death in the muddy fields of France. Now, Robert Graves, serving, was he a captain or a lieutenant? One of the two. He gives a very unflinching look at warfare on the front line, of warfare in the mud, of being bombarded for hours or days on end, and the human toll that war takes, not just in deaths, but in the aftermath of it, through injury, through mental and emotional turmoil. He describes some very powerful scenes. There's a particular scene where they go into no man's land. That is unreal. I had no idea. It's terrifying. At night, that is. There are other great works written around this. I think of All Quiet on the Western Front, and in some respects there's a naivety in All Quiet on the Western Front which is very pleasing. But Robert Graves is a trained writer. He is a poet, and some of his reflections come through that. But the growing cynicism amongst the soldiers towards the war. They were called the Lost Generation because they suffered the most cruel and outrageous conditions and treatment. Praised as heroes going, and as soon as the war was over, forgotten, cast aside, and were pretty much a nuisance because, the state had to deal with them and no one wanted to know anymore about what they'd been through. But when you've been through that cauldron of oppression, you imagine what that does to your emotions and your thoughts. It puts a very sharp edge. No wonder there's a lot of cynicism comes out of it, but also a lot of great perceptiveness comes from it. You cut through all the fluff to things that really matter. The men who went into the trenches formed very close bonds to the point they locked down and shut out the rest of the world because no one could experience what they had experienced, but he shares it. And like I say, he knows other poets. Siegfried Sassoon, of course, is one of them. It's absolutely fascinating whenever he turns up. And how he became sort of like pacifist. And this is just so eye-opening and splendidly written. Now, being an autobiography, it's not going to follow any kind of story format. He seems to just write and collate things as he feels they fit with each other. There is a certain chronology towards all of it. And of course, it goes from before the war to after the war as well, when he actually says goodbye to all that and leaves England for good. A really, really powerful piece of writing. But again, you don't just read this to say, oh, I've read Goodbye to All That. It's there to linger in. It's there to put on as a coat, to shuffle into no man's land, to seriously consider his thoughts about warfare. Don't go to this thinking your view is right and look to find it. Go to it and listen to someone who was there and take their words seriously. And yeah, this is a very rewarding book. It's quite haunting as well. It's not like gratuitous recounting of battles and all that, although they appear occasionally. If you want something like that, you read Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger, because he loved war, whereas Graves did not. I'll just read you the opening paragraph. It gives you an idea of his tone. As a proof of my readiness to accept autobiographical convention, let me at once record my two earliest memories. The first is being loyally held up at a window to watch a procession of decorated carriages and wagons for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. This was at Wimbledon, where I had been born on July 24th, 1895. The second is gazing upwards with a sort of despondent terror at a cupboard in a nursery, which stood accidentally open, filled to the ceiling with octavo volumes of Shakespeare. My father had organised the Shakespeare reading circle. I did not know until long afterwards that this was the Shakespeare cupboard, but apparently I already had a strong instinct against drawing-room activities. And when distinguished visitors came to the house, such as Sir Sidney Lee with his Shakespearean scholarship, or Lord Ashbourne, not yet a peer, with his loud talk of Ireland for the Irish and his saffron kilt, or Mr. Eustace Mills, the English real tennis champion and vegetarian, with his samples of exotic nuts, I knew all about them in my way. We're on to our 9th book on where to begin with more serious classics. And this one might surprise you, actually, because you may not think of this author as the most serious writer, but it is this beautiful edition, Chiltern Classics, Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. I really, really, really liked this book and was not expecting it. This is Jane Austen talking about virtue. When I talk about virtue, I'm not meaning just goodness and niceness. I'm talking about moral energy, moral vigour, depth of soul. Because in this book we have a great protagonist who wasn't so popular with Jane Austen's mother, nor with many readers later on. And it's Fanny Price. Now, Fanny Price comes to stay at Mansfield Park with her aunt, but her mother herself is quite poor. She grows up with her cousins, who are taught to treat her always as their cousin, but beneath them, because she comes from a poor background, and the cousin's mother is very, very, prestige conscious kind of thing. But she gets on with one of the cousins called Edmund, and the story grows, and you see the socialite life as these visitors come along, how the two cousins are trying to always bag themselves a husband who's got good land and an income. And then you get the visitors from London who seem so dramatic and wonderful and full of colour and, excitement and adventure. But like a lot of Jane Austen, how laughed at is the centrepiece for most people, and it's folly. Because Fanny Price, she is intrigued by characters, she is charmed, but then how she sees through the veneer and asks the question, are these people really moral? Now, today, this is not the most popular topic, because some people equate morality with being overly pious, to be stuck up. This postmodern world, which, everything is relative and do your own interpretation, no such thing as truth. People question morality. Now, what I will say about this morality in here, there is a link to biblical morality in the sense of Austen used to slightly ridicule the evangelicals of her day. But in writing to someone about this book, she says maybe they've got a point. Because there was a very seedy underbelly to the world of the Regency period. And there was a lot of lip service paid to morals, what we today would call virtue signalling. Sound good, do things that are easy to make you look good, say the right things, and you're a virtuous person, and you bask in your own glory of virtue. But really, when it comes to it, people being quite selfish, conniving, quick to turn on ones who offend them. They've got all the great show, but no depth of soul, no moral vigour. And that's what comes through in this. Fanny Price is definitely the most rock steady of characters. And she has this great ability, which challenges you as a reader, to have a desire which you are aware of, but to accept the facts and not let the heart rule the head. A lot of people think that's just pure logic. It's not so much logic that lets the head rule the heart, as it is grounded sense of virtue. Having a definite, fixed point on what is right and wrong. That's the thing that really makes logic, the head, triumph over the heart. Not just hard facts, which most people go to. You need a stable base from which to cause those things to be able to exert their effort. And that's what you get in Mansfield Park. Again, quite a slow book. Some really good scenes in there. I love the interaction between the two main characters. But it's a book, because serious books, if you want to understand why they're serious, you need to slow and think about them. Ponder them. What's the author saying? What have they seen? What are they trying to get across as their point? That, by the way, what I've just said, is not always a popular idea of approaching literature. And yet, clearly, when an author writes, they have a point to make. And I'll do another discussion on that. I'm not saying I always get their point correctly. I'm not saying that you identify it as exactly one thing. But there is a ballpark in which they're operating. And if you can grab hold of that and try it on, see if you learn something. I'll just read you the first part of the first paragraph, because the first paragraph runs to 2 pages. About 30 years ago, Miss Maria Ward of Huntingdon, with only £7,000, had the good luck to captivate Sir Thomas Bertram of Mansfield Park in the county of Northampton, and to be thereby raised to the rank of a baronet's lady, with all the comforts and consequences of an handsome house and large income. All Huntingdon exclaimed on the greatness of the match, and her uncle, the lawyer himself, allowed her to be at least £3,000 short of any equitable claim to it. She had 2 sisters to be benefited by her elevation, and such of their acquaintance as thought Miss Ward and Miss Frances quite as handsome as Miss Maria did not scruple to predict their marrying with almost equal advantage. But there certainly are not so many men of large fortune in the world as there are pretty women to deserve them. Miss Ward, at the end of half a dozen years, found herself obliged to be attached to the Reverend Mr. Norris, a friend of her brother-in-law, with scarcely any private fortune. And Miss Frances fared yet worse. Now, it's got that lightness of touch, very distinctive to Jane Austen. That is very much her style. You hear that and you think Austenian. But don't be tricked into thinking that it's just light and froth. It's a cappuccino head. Oh, it's got the espresso bitterness beneath it. The depth, the black churning waters. Because this book, like I say, it's virtue, it's morality. And it challenges us about what we seek in life. The 10th and final book on this list of classic books, which are good to begin with if you want to get into or experience what's meant by the more serious classics, is the brilliant Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This is a book that is almost impossible to describe. Emily Bronte writes with such force of emotion, and I don't mean sentimentality, just power of presence and being and personality, that I think it even gets out of her hands. In our Patreon group, which we haven't discussed all these books in Patreon, some of them, but this was one, and it spawned one of the best discussions, one of the best Zoom discussions when we meet up at the end of a month to discuss the read of the month. Because it's so forceful, and it's not an easy read in the sense of there's nothing hard about reading, but, there's darkness in this book. There's violence. I don't mean gory violence. The Brontes didn't write that. But there's domestic abuse in this book. There's hardness towards young ones. There's a perplexity of character in the 2 protagonists, or the 2 main characters, who are Cathy Earnshaw and Heathcliff. Now, Heathcliff is adopted by Cathy's father. He finds him, some little street urchin in Liverpool, brings him home and showers him in affections to the point that others become, well, the family, the children of the dad, sort of hate him for it because he displaces them. But Kathy and him have this lock in personalities. You know the idea that you're born as one half of a soul, and that you try and find the other half of yourself out there in the world. This is a Victorian idea. It's been around for quite a long time. That's Kathy and Heathcliff. It turns out they are one character. There's a famous phrase, I am Heathcliff and Heathcliff is me. But through all of this, the turmoil, the tumult that goes on as Heathcliff yearns to be with Kathy, but the decisions that she makes, and it follows the generations following, and Heathcliff is always involved. He is the typical anti-hero, Byronic hero. For some reason, back in the day, people, thought it was wonderful. They're swept off their feet by Heathcliff, but he's a monster in many respects. There's a skill in the way of narrating this, because it's narrated by a visiting person who's come to stay at Wuthering Heights after the majority of all of the story has finished. And he learns it through a maid or a nurse who was on hand. And it gives it a certain folklorian legend kind of vibe to it, set amongst the wild moors. It's all in isolation. It is so gothic in that respect, set against nature, set with a great house, foreboding. Go and watch my video, by the way, on 8 aspects of Gothic literature. If you want to understand literature better, that's a really good place to go. I'll put the link down below somewhere. But in this book, I don't want to give anything away. It's the power of two personalities, of love out of control, of letting your passions go, but also the role suppression plays on things, and the role of revenge and brooding, not letting go of something, bearing a grudge, and the lengths that can drive a person to. It is powerful, but I challenge you at the end of the book to be able to summarize the book. It's not because there's not a story, but it just becomes too powerful for Emily Bronte even to control. And it makes me wonder what she would have written had she carried on living and not died young, because this is quite the, achievement to put out. And I think it is a brilliant book to enter into the serious classics. I rank this higher than all the other Brontes, because you have to walk around and think about this. Like, what does she mean? Why this? Why that? And where's she going with this? What was she trying to say by the end of it? Spawned a brilliant conversation, and I would heartily recommend reading Wuthering Heights. It won't be everyone's cup of tea. No book is everyone's cup of tea. You may not like all of these. If you pick one and it's not your thing, don't think the others are all the same and like it. It's not a list. That is my personal preferences. This is a list of books I spent some time thinking about, because some have said they want to get into the classics, but a lot of the videos, including my own, sometimes brings up classics of their type, of their genre, but are not necessarily the deeper classics with the capital C, which explore the human condition. And that's what these books are. They're all accessible, in my opinion. The hardest amongst them, the most disorienting maybe in style, is Alone in Berlin. The others are pretty much straightforward to read. A lot of them are slow, so don't look for whiz bang and fireworks. Just enjoy experiencing the human being in like a real life. If you were to describe your real life, probably, no offense, but most people would find it boring, apart from a few scintilla of events that happen to you. That is human beings. So experience humanity through the books. But tell me below which one you think is best. And if you would like to either get exclusive content from me and join a book club where I do a review of a book every single month, or you just want to help support my channel because you appreciate the effort that goes into all of this, then consider going to my Patreon and signing up. You can get a £3.49 level, I believe. That's one video a month and access to joining the chats if you want to. Or it's £5.99. You get some extra videos as well. So yes, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please let me know down below which one you like the most of, or sound the most of. Which one you like the sound of most is what I'm trying to say. And if you could do me a favour, if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. But share this video with other people who you know like books. Please share it. It helps me out, and it also keeps alive the idea of reading to better ourselves. So until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you read.